Hi everyone. We've got episode 4 of our What If series today, and again another special one with another dear friend from Kernel. Just to introduce what if is, it's a series of conversations into the unknown and those unacknowledged thoughts that you might begin to think about but quickly dismiss. How do we build our new world? It's a big question. But we know we can't do it without radical imagination of the current system and structures that we have in place. So we've really tried to go to the edges of our collective mind space, which is, many of the friends and people that we've met through the Web3 space that are doing really amazing work to help guide us in our own world building and your world building too. So each of our guests is what we're calling an imagination rebel. They're looking for new ways of being, new ways of connecting, and exploring those great ideas on the fringes of society. And we want to kind of bring those to the forefront and then share them. And yeah, just like learn together about different ways of being. So this conversation is a really special one. We have Glenn joining us from Biddle FM, and I hope I'm saying that right, but Glenn, you can always correct us. And also working on some other really cool projects that I hope we get to talk about as well, like Meem .wtf. But what we like to do, so these conversations take place on the new moon of each month. We're a little bit late for this new moon, but still, February new moon is the one that we're starting on. And the reason we do that is because it's a time for just kind of resetting and being open to kind of new possibilities. So we think it's always a great time to kind of start thinking and probing these ideas. We like to start with some words from Sister Tebebwa, who is also a member of Kernel, and each month gives us some beautiful words about the moon and what to expect. So I'm just going to read some words from her about the February new moon. It's a good time for endings and beginnings, particularly new beginnings, making a fresh start, turning over a new leaf, or starting a new project. Truly, this is a great chance to make important changes in our lives, including letting go of which no longer serves us and placing our energy only on which feeds us. That might find us by focusing on structures and organizations or simplifying our lives, decluttering and questioning old habits and behaviors and beliefs as we search for new and incentive ways to progress. We can reach our goals with hard work, wisdom, determination, practicality, patience, and persistence, while still consciously putting time aside for peaceful and rejuvenating activities and sharing our dreams with others. So by working with our emotions, imaginations, visualization skills, intuition, passion, our wisdom, our dreams, psychic abilities, emotions, creativity, and spirituality, this time will increase our ability to sense danger, protect others, and ensure that as we delve deeper into achieving our goals, we'll actually get more out of them for both ourselves and the earth. So that's kind of February, which is like, yeah, it's always good. I think it's always like a nice way to open up and start thinking, okay, new beginnings, always talks about new projects, or yourself searching for new ideas, which I think is great.
Feeling fresh.
Yes, exactly. February is a good month. So yeah, maybe Fang, do you want to take it away and introduce the project and Glenn?
Absolutely. It's always so refreshing to hear or even read Sister Tibet's words. So yeah, I'm really happy that we start like this. I'm going to introduce Glenn. Glenn is the co-founder of Bitless Almanac, which we'll be talking in a bit about. He's also a Kernel Block 5 fellow and currently based in Oakland with a critical theorist, a 4-year-old, and 2 pit bulls. In the past, Glenn has been also a consultant, product manager, VC, and founder. But he says that has never been more fun now than building in Web3. Glenn is also building Meem that enables portable communities. A fun fact from Glenn is that he can sing the Encanto soundtrack from memory, which we'll be looking forward to hearing soon. And
which says more about the age of my daughter than I think it does about me, but yeah.
And a bit about Biddlers, which Glenn will tell us a bit more about. Builders has evolved ever since its inception, and the primary goal is now around creating a third space, virtual cafe type of space for builders. And this is the purpose of the Discord. And the Almanac is a publication of a more distant goal to evolve towards. So without further ado, I would like us to kind of like really delve into these months what if question. What if we can create new online spaces?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for having me, guys. This is awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about Biddlers and share all the stuff we're doing in our little cozy corner of the web.
Yeah, I love that. And I like, the cozy corner is a nice way to start this, actually. And yeah, like for us, it's like, I think like we like to start with a little bit about yourself. So maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself and how you kind of, found yourself building Biddle FM, and also tell us if that's the correct way to say it.
Yeah, that's totally right. Yeah, it's been a kind of winding road. So I think this iteration of things for me really started. I took a break. I'd previously done Web 2 stuff, trial pay, and had been a consultant at BCG, done a bunch of other kind of like more institutionalized stuff. And then I took a break after my daughter was born in 2018, which was amazing, life-changing, all those things. And then when I started to think about what I wanted to do next, I was thinking about getting back onto the operating side and what I wanted to build, and I was spending a lot of time just like thinking about the harms of social media. And so that was kind of the most that kind of started the path on which I'm on now, and so that's kind of probably the most relevant starting point. So at that point I met up with this guy Tim Kendall. Tim had been previously the president of Pinterest, had been part of the folks building the Facebook ad model, and we started, he then recognized a lot of the harms of social media, and so he was really working on the same problem, right? So how do you help deal with those harms of social media? And so we started working together on this project called Moment that was kind of dealing with social media addiction. And it's from there that I actually met Sarah, my co-founder of Meem, and we started building around this idea of like how instead of trying to get people off of their phones, which is kind of the initial piece that we were focused on with Moment, we started thinking about how do you build an alternative? Like, what does it look like to build socially healthier social networks? Like, what does it look like to build an app that the goal of it is closeness and connection and not, scale in these ways? And so we started playing around with those ideas and experimenting, and eventually came up with something that was working reasonably well. It's kind of a group chat with remixable prompts that we're playing with. And we spun that out as a separate company, and we had that team from the team at Moment, all kind of oriented around this: how do you build socially healthier tools effectively? And so that was kind of the starting point. And then as we were doing that, I fell down the rabbit hole through in all the Web3 stuff. So I mean, we were very much like Web3 in kind of body, if not in mind yet. So we were building in Web 2 and we're building an app, but I remember I was trying to think about how to incorporate exit to community into some of the initial thinking. I remember talking to Ethan Turner ages ago on this of like, how he had this paper on building user trusts effectively into C Corp structures, and I was trying to think about, is there a way for us to do this? And so it was just super interesting as a starting point, but then found DAOs effectively through FWB and some of these things. Oh my God, it's all here. And so it was definitely like we're already starting to move towards this. What does it look like for community to be able to manage their own tools and their own affordances and not have these third parties that are distorting our behavior in various ways that's making us behave in all these other ways in these spaces. And so we were already kind of moving down that path, but I think once I saw the Web3 stuff, I couldn't unsee it. And so we all held hands and jumped into this whole world, and I think that's been part of the kind of magical ride. But then from there I can take you through kernel and some of these other things. But that was kind of the starting point, at least, of where it got.
But what was it for you, Glenn, for example? Because like for me, and I guess like for Nirmala, that might be like different things. But what was it for you, for example, like of Web3 that excited you so much at the beginning? Like, I'm really curious.
Yeah, like a couple of the things that like I found really so I remember like Loot broke my brain, right? So Loot was this, it was the Loot project, and so it was It was one of Dom's early experiments where he dropped a bunch of these. Essentially, it was just assets for a game that didn't exist, right? And then there was this crazy rush to buy up these assets, but then what it created was a community around these assets. Were like, oh, like this doesn't exist. We have to build this game. And so it was kind of Dungeons and Dragons, like which was never kind of my main bag, but man, well targeted at the Ethereum community for sure. And then suddenly you had, everyone started to build around it. So you had this really decentralized way of like, oh, I'm gonna, now we need characters, we need maps, we need how do we actually build this game? And so there was the over financialization stuff that happened with all the NFT projects in this way. But I think at core of it was something really special of like, oh, there's this different relationship for how folks can start building together and are aligned to build together that doesn't have to be from a point of corporate authority. And I think that was the part that like really started to shift for me. And then nouns was one of the other things that really broke my brain too, which is I think that whole project as to how you can coordinate public goods building and funding in this really new way. So I think it unlocked for me like this new way of thinking about NFTs, not as like, I think about them less as assets and more about like now that we have a shared state, we can actually agree on certain relationships, and those relationships we can then build from in all these interesting ways. And we have these new tools to create community effectively and manage community. And like that's where it all started. Is I think once I saw that, I was just like, I can't unsee it. I can't go back. And so we had to jump effectively. But I think those were a couple of things. And then FWB was the other one. We're kind of seeing from the inside how just the engagement of that community and how it was kind of self-forming and how people were thinking about building tools for themselves in that way. I think those were three that really stuck with me, is like, oh, this is a really new set of tools that we haven't had before to help create something that doesn't look like the companies of past. And I think that was what really like transformed for me, at least. Yeah, I'm curious what you guys like. What were the things that most spiked for you early on that got you into it? Like, how do you fall down?
I think I would agree on the Loop project. That was a really interesting one. When I saw that, I was like, what's happening? And then it was like, yeah, like it kind of unlocks this thing to see how people connect to it. And just, yeah, it's like a creative prompt, really gets people engaging. Yeah, I thought it was like, that was a really interesting project. And a lot of the stuff that Dom had done in the space too was like super interesting. I think, yeah, I'm trying to think what other projects, but I think it was that one definitely. I think Nouns is also a really cool example. I think it's also just like actually coming into Kernel, because Fang and I are also KB5 members, and just encountering all the different people doing totally different things is really cool. Because I think when I first kind of saw it, it was like, oh, it's like, you get this very kind of small perspective on what it is, and you kind of like, is that what it's about? It's just about PFPs or something. But then when you kind of see all these different people building and like really building functional, like you said, like totally new ways of like working together and coordinating, you're like, oh, this is really amazing. And then I think actually when we did, at Dev Connect, we went to Shelling Point too, and yeah, just seeing like some of the ideas that people have, and also just seeing the excitement around it, and the vibe of these events. So I think you going to East Denver, you'll probably also get to vibe off that energy. And I think that's really cool too, right? Because I don't think I've been in a space, I don't know, like in a workspace anyway, with that kind of this energy that's kind of happening now in Web3. So it's quite addictive and intoxicating.
Oh, totally. No, I think Kernel was like this other step change for me. Like I think for a while we were kind of like in the wilderness, right? And like I was kind of finding some of these folks where I'm like, oh, we're actually talking about the same big thing, these same big ideas, right? And I would run into some of these folks, and I remember Jasmine Wang was one that like I was just so like, man, I couldn't believe the stuff that she was doing. I was so excited about it. And so she's the one who mentioned Kernel to me. Like I didn't really know much about Kernel otherwise, but I'm like, okay, what like if Jasmine says this is interesting, okay, like I need to pay attention to it. And so I think once I got in that first day of like getting into the Slack and feeling like, oh my God, I found my tribe kind of thing. Everybody is here that has this kind of orientation of care and like what this bigger thing can be. And that was just so transformative that, yeah, it felt like the thing I was looking for. Is like, oh, great, like here are all the people that see that too. And that was just like accelerated everything for me for sure.
Can one of you explain noun just for myself and then for the people that don't know what noun?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So Nouns is it's a daily auction of one NFT per day, and when you sell that NFT, the funds from that auction go into a treasury, and the holders of those NFTs then become the folks that manage that treasury. That then essentially there are grants that they give out to projects, and the only goal of those projects is to perpetuate the meme of the Nouns NFTs, which are Creative Commons CC0 licensed, right? So that anybody can use this IP, but the idea is like as you grow the value of that meme, the value of those holding that NFT will grow, and it kind of will create this virtuous cycle. So just really fundamentally new way of how do you build an organization and support public goods and build IP. It's really utterly fascinating.
And now there's like Nouns Builder, which is a tool, or like, tools launched by Zora, where you can actually like create a similar project using that same concept. And yeah, which is also really cool. That I think was really, obviously inspired by that project.
Totally.
Yeah. But maybe, Glenn, it'd be good to hear a bit more now about Biddle, and actually, you kind of talk about this thing called the third space. And I'd love to hear, like, what do you mean by that? And what was it that kind of inspired you to start this community?
Yeah, so the genesis of Biddlers is interesting. So I met Rory, my co-founder of Biddlers in Kernel, and we started talking about coffee and other things we care about, and it's just like she's such an amazing person that I just couldn't help but wanted to talk to Rory all the time, effectively. And so I think that's what a lot of this came out of, is just conversations with Rory, and how do we just like continue having those conversations all the time and broaden them to all of our friends effectively. And so that was a starting point. And then at the time, I was just really enamored with Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog, and thinking a lot about what that was. And so I was talking to Ray about like, man, I wonder if we could do like a decentralized Whole Earth catalog, like take this same idea of getting your friends that really care about something to write about why they care about it, and explain that thing and recommend it to others, and just like how do you have your friends curating your attention on to their favorite things. And so that was kind of the genesis of what we started eventually calling Biddler's Almanac, which is just what is this curation as care, in terms of like these kinds of recommendations that are done in care. And that's the reason that you're doing them, is that you want to share with others the thing that's so special, and particularly you want to share it in a way that you think they'll care about too, and will be special for them. How do you curate that experience and their own attention? And so that was kind of the starting point, is like, what would that look like? And I think a lot of the Whole Earth catalog was very DIY, right, in terms of its focus, and maybe a little bit more individual in that way. And we're thinking more in community now. It's like, what does it look like for communities to build their own tools? And so, the subset or the subtitle of the Whole Earth catalog is access to tools, right? And I just love that. And I think so we're thinking about, what are tools for a decentralized society? What is access to tools where communities have their own tools, that it's not we're assembling in these digital spaces that are owned and managed by companies that are yes, trying to keep us happy and coming back, but also very interested, and primarily interested in returns for their shareholders necessarily. And so that was kind of the starting point of Biddlers. And so I think the way the third place is always this, there's home, there's work, and the third place is where these other conversations happen, these connections of people, right? So it's the cafes, it's churches, it's coffee shops. And I think this was primarily, I think it preceded him, but Robert Putnam wrote this book, Bowling Alone, which is now like 20 years old, but it was kind of on the looking, at least in the US, of the kind of decline of many of those institutions, right? Of like the decline of the church, the decline of the bowling league. That's the whole thing, is like we're just more kind of separated into our own little family units that then kind of transact with each other rather than have these kind of more communal spaces. And so I think as we think about then what's happened with digital spaces, and how much of our time, our relationships are now mediated in this way, but are now mediated by corporate authority effectively is the way that we have multiplayer experiences today on the web. And those are all mediated in these ways that we are not aligned interest-wise with those who are building those spaces and defining how we can be together. And so I think a lot of what Biddlers is more broadly is like, how do we just as a community, just for Rory and I and our friends and the way that we want to care for each other and our community of people, like what does it look like to create that in a way that these humans that want to together care for each other, how do we build a space digitally that we can control the affordance of, think about what tools do we want to build together, what are those gifts for each other, and then as we build those things, how do we enable others to participate in them too. So those are the kind of genesis of it. But yeah, it's taken lots of different forms, and I think the almanac is ultimately this idea of how do you think about curating media and curating the attention of a community in care, rather than trying to maximize attention, but really, trying to focus on what you think is something they'd love, for instance. Yeah.
I love I love your I love your explanation of like third space. Like you just blew my mind. Glenn.
Yeah, and that's like a 30-year-old thing. That's not me. That's like a, I think
No,
that's but I think that what that looks like in the digital place is something that I think we're still like, we've largely had that defined for us. Like what, Twitter and the public commons, it's not a commons, right? Like Twitter is in control of that community and manages who's included or excluded. And so we're not controlling how we can be together on Twitter. That company is deciding how that is. And they're making those decisions based on how they'll return money to their shareholders. And that's a different thing than how we can think about the local coffee shop owner. We can think about what that looks like in kind of different. So I think this kind of orientation then for Biddlers is much more of like, how do we then go like for digital spaces? How do we similarly imagine people building for others in community rather than building out of greed or selfishness for themselves, at least in some capacity for what they want from it, but rather, what do you want to give to others? So I think that's the genesis, at least.
One follow-up question I have for you, actually, talking about shared spaces and media, I think there's a lot of interesting, I want to talk more about Biddle too, and how you kind of see, what that means for tools, but also media. But what are your thoughts on like, NFT now are really pushing this idea of tokenized media and are launching something. Our Friends with Benefits just launched an app, not so much about media, but about community. And then the third thing to just throw in there, which I thought was interesting because you mentioned Twitter, was Elon Musk just tweeted, say what you think about me, but I just bought the world's biggest not-for-profit for $40 billion, which I thought was interesting that he called it a not-for-profit. But yeah, I think it's interesting, like just maybe just talking about the media and like how, like you said, what are the new structures? Like right now, you said it's like we really have this monopoly on our attention with, everything's kind of controlled and funneled to, generating revenue in different ways. How do you see some of these other projects or your own project trying to really change that? Like how do you battle that attention economy?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's exactly like the core of the problem. And yeah, I think the FWB building their own app for their own community is at the start of a wave of something different. I think Kernel building their own tools for Kernel is another example, or even just the Ethereum ecosystem more broadly. Like how does this community start building our own tools that we want in the ways that we want them, so that it's not, I think the first, my view of the Web 1.2.3 thing is not read, write, own so much, but like Web 1 being like, oh, you actually have these peer-to-peer connections. It's hard, but like people are doing it. They're deciding what they want to post and who can read, and they're connecting in all these ways. Like I think Web 2 enabled a massive scaling of multiplayer experiences, but on the back of corporate authority, right? Those multiplayer experiences are because some company has decided to package these technologies into the tool that then those communities can use, and that's what left us open effectively for all these ways that our behavior is then distorted and extracted through lock-in and all these things. And then, like, I think where Web3 is different is we can start effectively being in agreement with our communities ourselves, right? And we can through these protocols be able to build our own tools and have our own tools. And so I think this difference of communities being able to decide their own affordances of those spaces, like what does the FWB app look like inside of there? Like it's what the friends within that community want it to look like, right? There's no other, like, they build for the friends of that community, and that's the difference. That's a very different thing than some builders, Twitter building for a space for, the public graph in this way. But like, it's not really public, right? It's a community that they're building, that they're managing the inclusion and exclusion of people to, and then trying to figure out how to make money off of maximizing our attention or having us pay for whatever it looks like. And so I think the shape of that looks really different. And so, I think in many ways, Musk buying Twitter was a real kind of helpful example, where like even just the number of people that now know what Mastodon ActivityPub is, right? It's like it's huge, of like understanding that, oh, you thought this was actually, this is a public graph. This was the comments. It is not the comments. In fact, like, it is enclosed. And the same things about like whether Trump is allowed on the platform or not, or all these things of free speech. I think this is like very much like, if this is a community, how do we decide who can be in that community or not? And if you're someone who has trans friends or other people that like you care about, and this community says this is okay for people to be in this community to be able to attack people you care about, then like what are the options you have for excluding people? That's in my mind where wokeness comes from, right? Is this idea of like, well, we need to find some way of protecting the people in our community, and so the only tools we have are reputational tools. So we're not going to deal with you in this way because you're harmful to the people we care about, right? So like, there has to be some other way of mitigating that, right? So I think like this is touching on more of what I do with Meem, right? Where like part of what we're trying to do is create enabling these ideas of portable communities that are not bound to a platform or an application you're in, but they're agreements that people can make together, that they create, they deploy, they manage in whatever way they want. How they relate to one another, how they want their tools to work, that's all for the community to decide. And then we can figure out how to plug different applications and tools into that community that is based on those decisions that the community decides, not the tool builders, right? Like, and so I think that's where the broader piece goes. I think Biddlers is then kind of one of those, at least my spiritual home, which is like kind of, oh, like, what's a way that we can imagine for our own community of care? What are the tools we might want to have together? How do we want to use it? Like, and we're starting in Discord. We're starting with a third party's tools, but like, I think ultimately the idea is like, how do we here are all these humans. It doesn't matter that we're in Discord. We're in Discord right now, but like, we're also in all these other places. And what is the way that those humans at that agreement level, that basic level of, who it's kind of like a sheet music to the metaverse in some ways, right? It's like, what is the actual relations of the people that we care about? And then the tools that we use can then, we can hopefully control our own affordances, or we can make our own choices as to how those things work. But that's the kind of broader sweep is that. And I think all of those examples of tokenized communities are starting points of some of these portable communities that we're starting to see. And Balaji's network state is another like way of talking about some of this with a particular angle. But I think the broader idea being agreements are what we're able to now have together, like what websites were of coming online. And I think agreements are this next wave of what this will look like. And we're really, really just at the beginning of what those things can look like in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of like also, Glenn, want to kind of like take a step back, because I think this is so interesting about Biddlers on, so just like also learning from Kernel, just like words, the words that we use matter. And then the way that we use the words also matter. And just reading through the Biddlers almanac, it's just like so full of words that are so meaningful to me, and then like to all of us. And one of the examples is the reason why you decided to call it Biddlers instead of builders. And I would love for you to expound on that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we had this idea first before the name, obviously, and we were thinking a lot about what is this thing that we really felt in Kernel too, is like it's folks that are building not for themselves but for others, right? And in the same way that like everyone will always point to like, oh, humans are naturally selfish and that's why this is, but like humans are naturally caring too, and we can choose which of these things we want to feed. And so I think I visited Rory in Brooklyn in the summer, and I remember we were kind of playing with these ideas, and I would just like every place I would go into, every coffee shop, I would just start talking to folks about this. And it's not like a Web3 thing, right? It's very much this like, by recognizing the people who are building in care, and they can take lots of different forms. It doesn't have to be, they're for-profits, they're nonprofits, they're co-ops, they're churches, but there's something similar across this way of building where it's just like you're trying to do something in care of a community. And so I think coffee shops are a really good example where you kind of feel that difference. It's kind of the local versus the chain thing in some ways, but like, if you go into a coffee shop and they remember your order, or they're like, the way they make this for you, it's about caring for that community, for that community's breakfast, for that community's coffee. And by talking about that with those folks, like, they feel seen. And when you're like, it's not this transactional zero-sum thing where they're doing it to try to get more money out of you. That's not the reason folks are doing it, right? And I think that difference of kind of like narrowing in on what that is was really the kind of core. So we had that as like, we were playing with that idea for a long time. We were trying to think about, oh man, what do we call this thing? What is that person that does that? And wanting something that like that to be the meme for this kind of builder in Web3, right? That is like, it's not about, in many ways, like Web3 became known through NFTs is the opposite thing. It was about the greed. It was about the like, the scam and all this thing. But yet this was the promise, was this other thing that we already identified as like, is not unique to Web3. It's happening all over the place. We already live in a decentralized society in that way that has communities that are building in this way. And like, that's across anywhere in the political spectrum. The Chamber of Commerce, in a southern city, like, does exactly this versus, what might look like a collective action organization here in Oakland, right? And so like, you already have folks that are sharing something here. And so where Bidlers initially came from is Rory was kind of deeper in the Ethereum community. And I think early on, Bitcoiners would have this phrase HODL, right? HODL. And the idea there was largely like in forums, as people are rapidly like, the price is going down. It's kind of this exhortation to like, don't sell, right? Because it's all about the price, right? And in many ways, like it actually really focused on this other way, this other selfishness thing where it's like, the reason that you're doing this together is because price needs to go up, right? And at the time, then I think the Ethereum community's response of these kind of open source builders who are here for this broader reason was, don't hodl, like biddle, right? Like do this, like, it's not about the price, it's about like building things together. And so there was already this meme that was kind of embedded within the Ethereum community. Even at ETH Denver, there's a biddle week, right? Like there is this kind of broader thing. And so like, we just recognize like, well, this is actually really is the idea. It's just like, can we focus on what is a bidler? And how do we like have that be the meme of what it is to be in this kind of new way of building? But it actually has nothing to do with the technology. It's much more of this like other way of building, which is for others in care of community. And can we use it that way? And then, yes, we think we have a new set of tools to unlock a bunch of that stuff, but like that's the kind of core thing is biddle, then in its own misspelling is just the attention of like, yes, it's building, but it is this other flavor to it, which is about building for others, and not just for self, right? And I think that's the, it just fit, well, if we're going, the meme already kind of existed, we're like, oh, great, let's just feed that and think about it more broadly as not being a Web3 or a crypto thing, but rather just like that my local coffee shop here in Oakland, like, man, that guy cares for the community, like does everything he can to remember like everybody's order, like tries to keep his prices low so that everybody can continue to like be cared for in community. Like I think it's a different vibe that you get, and it's like, how do we name that vibe? And we call it bidlery, we call it like, that just becomes the thing that we focus in on and support. So I think it just fit perfectly what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think, yeah, in the context of hold versus build, like, what really creates value is not just holding. The value comes from actually building, like, and that's like a real true community is not just the price stays the same or stays stagnant, it's really like the community is active in building stuff for them and kind of creating that. I think the value, it's probably immeasurable right now. Price is such a measurable value. Community is really hard to measure value, but we know it's there. It's just we don't have the framework to define it. So I think what's really interesting too, like you talking about a cafe a lot in terms of building a community, a cafe builds its community off this really face-to-face direct conversation. Like people come in and buy a coffee or have a coffee and have a meal and sit there and invite their friends. And yeah, it is actually a really great analogy for how do you build a community. through that direct face-to-face, you know, creating a space for them. So I think that's really beautiful. And I'd love
Yeah, that's
to hear
totally
more about, yeah, like how are you, you know, like taking this coffee analogy a bit further, or like this cafe analogy further, how are you designing your cafe? Or like, what are the things you think about when you and Rory are like, okay, let's set up our cafe, or whatever, you know, however you define it. What are the things you think about?
yeah, yeah. It's a great question, because I think like I think also recognize like how much of what we try to do is just go back to like what those in real life human affordances are, and that's part of why like even the early, like looking at Web 1 stuff when they were first, like what are bulletin boards, what were MUDs, or like the you know, multi-user dungeon you know, stuff that like where folks were trying to create digital spaces that were familiar to what were your in real life spaces. And I think in some ways like Web 2 then took us in this other direction, right? Where, you know, actually Clay Shirky has this amazing piece that was like, I think it was like from, maybe it was like 2005, 2006, it was like they saw kind of multiplayer web coming, and it was this like, and now reading it, it feels so new and fresh in some ways, because it's just like we went so far off the path as to how we think about building for scale versus building for, you know, connectedness and closeness. And so yeah, I think yeah, that's definitely been a big part of it, is like that how do we think about what does conversation look like in these spaces? I think in many ways you know, all community is just like meta conversation effectively. It's just like how is it that we relate to each other in these spaces? And I've been tutored a little bit by Philip Sheldrake, who's amazing. I think you guys might know from Kernel, who's like just brilliant on identity stuff. But he's really brought me into this conversation theory, which this guy Pask was writing on, that like it's just like how to think about conversation as this kind of core way of managing information and knowledge building and learning together. And it's just been kind of transformational. I think like this is similar to how you're kind of defining what those spaces look like, right? It's like, how do we define who can be in what ways, and how we bring resources and knowledge and media into those spaces, and how do we work with that in that conversational place, and what are the rules that we have together, you know, stated or unstated, and how are those things managed in terms of how we can be together, and how do we arrive at those kinds of rules and roles that we have in those spaces, and then, you know, what do we want to do together there? What do we put on our shared record, either like our rules or our you know, things that we want to publish together, whatever it is, like, and that kind of way of thinking more abstractly about what those spaces look like. The same is true of a physical space, of like, you know, if you and I were sitting in a coffee shop together, like who has to agree on the ways we can be together, right? It's like if either of us offends each other, like you can ask me to leave, I can ask you to leave, I can leave. Like if we offend the coffee shop owner and says, oh, this is not the way I want people to be in my coffee shop, you can ask me to leave. So that there's like an agreement that we have between the participants in these spaces that is implicit often. But I think like as we think about digital spaces, like what does that look like today? It's like, oh, those rules, those roles that we have are being set by these other parties, right? And so I think one of the amazing things about the growth of the cozy web is that like this is this kind of private, authentic digital spaces that you can define for yourselves what is in and what is out. How do you want to manage your own members and the ways that they can be together? And so I think it's kind of giving birth to this starting point. And so as we think about setting up, you know, Biddler's, you know, we have Biddler's Lodge is our Discord server, and we think about it very much as like, how do we get our affordances as close as we can to like, this is our home, you know, online, and you know, when you arrive on the lawn, and like we'll wave to you and say like, oh, it's you, like great, come up on the porch, and we'll give you, you know, effectively give you the role of being on the porch with us. And anybody can chat on the porch, what have you, but you can imagine having these different spaces that different people have different access to. And like, and I think we can continue playing with some of these different places, even, and they can be different within our place. Like, you know, being in the, you know, the den inside the lodge versus being in the studios and talking about work in the cafe in a studio space, or being on that porch, all have different affordances as to who is there and how you use that space. And so I think even just using that not as like a, oh, this is where we talk about X, but more like it's a space that has, here are the people who are the hosts, here are the people who are the guests, and what is the way that we can manage that differently in different places, and can we start expanding what that looks like. And so in some ways VR I think is a really helpful thing to think about, even in non-VR spaces, where you have to imagine presence together in some way, where it's just like you're entering some space. What can you do in that space? Who can post what? What are the ways that gets moderated or mediated by whom? And like, how do you make those decisions together? And can that be different in different spaces within that space too? And how do you start imagining those things? So I think that's kind of where we started. It's just like, how do we make this as close to how we our imagined lodge as we can, where like all of our digital friends can be together. And I think I've seen a lot of similar things across lots of Discord servers and Slacks, and where people are making different choices as to who are the hosts and who are the guests, what's okay and what's not okay, and what is the reason that they're doing those things together. I think exploring those things together and starting to figure out what are those agreements and how do we take them with us, right? How do we plug those into the social tools we use, so that those agreements can actually be between us, is how that works, and not with some third party that's making those decisions as to like how they want us to spend more and more attention. I would rather you spend less attention, but that attention be so well cared for. If you have 1 minute, then like, oh, let me show you this great thing that you will love, and like have that be your experience of how you are cared for then by this community, rather than like, let me try to get as much attention as you can, or even that Biddlers has some goal. The only goal is care. And so like, what does it look like to build it that way? How do we resist the ambition to do more than that, or to build it, or to grow it, or to scale it in some way, and have that be what pulls us forward, is like, allow it to be. And that's something I have to resist a lot, right? Because I will constantly abstract and say like, oh man, how do we get that big thing? And I think where Rory really helps me a lot there is like, oh, like, let's let's let this emerge, right? Like, what are the we'll find by intuition, in the same way that you will in a coffee shop, of knowing when is the right time to invite someone into the back of the coffee shop where you make the coffee, or whatever the thing is. Like, do that in an intuitive human way, where you're interacting, you're in conversation, and not setting some rules for some goal that you have of what you want that to be. So I think the more human, the more coffee shop we can feel in deciding things in our digital spaces, the better off we will be as a community, and the more caring we can be.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, there's so many things that you said that I want to ask you a follow-up question on, but I'll start with this one, because it also talks about another project you work on. You were talking about conversation theory, and I think that's really interesting. And obviously at Kernel, we talk a lot about conversations. You also have a project called Meem.whatif, MEEM.WTF. And there was a tool I saw on there called Symphony, which allows people to group publish. I think that's interesting. Like, how is that a new type of conversation? Groups talking to groups, or groups talking as one. Do you want to share a bit more about, Meem, but also the Symphony tool, and why, what was the inspiration to create that, and how is it being used?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I think the broader the broader vision for Meem is, like, as we've been talking about these portable communities, and we see some examples like Kernel and FWB and MetaLabel and others that have been hugely inspirational for us. Like, what does it look like to create these communities between people that then can build their own tools? And a big part of how we think about what Meem is doing is, how do we enable more and more communities to do that, where and community, I think, can be really broadly defined as anybody who's in agreement, right? So I think we have a view of what DAOs look like, for instance, and I think that's a really great starting point for what some of these things can be. But it's actually true of like anything across digital spaces that now we can agree on. So take a piece of media like your guys' podcast, right? Like, now that we are at least within a community, we can decide on what the roles we each have with that podcast, right? Like, what is that social graph of that piece of media? So you guys are the hosts of the podcast. I'm a guest. There might be listeners. There might be people that listen all the way. There might be people that love it. There might be people that comment. There's all these different relationships that we can have, and now together in community, we can decide on what those relationships are, and then we can start building things around that, right? And so that's what Meem is most broadly. And then so as I think where we started them with Symphony was really interesting. It was really inspired by a project that MetaLabel did called Chorus, which was starting to like, oh, just how do you tweet together as a Discord? And everybody in MetaLabel really loved it when Musk was saying, oh, we're gonna shut down the API. There was real sadness of this thing going away. Oh, this is the way this community tweets together. And so I think that was a big part of, as we were thinking about it, like, how do communities, going to conversation theory, like, how do communities manage those spaces, right? In terms of who can post what in a space, and like, outside of whether it's Discord or Twitter, whatever it is, this is where we're starting. It's like, oh, how do you manage the space of Discord, of who can post in that channel, who can make marks in that channel, and what do those marks mean to that community? So if you get 5 likes on that, then the community will tweet it out, and like, if you have a role that is allowed to approve the thing for the community, whatever it is. So like, communities can decide for themselves how they want that to work. How do you want to decide what the editorial process looks like? Is it just the democratic, everybody can vote? Does someone have to approve? Can sort of any of that shape can change in terms of how you want to manage that space, and then what gets published out of that space somewhere else. So now you're managing that community's voice in a different space, in Twitter, right? And like, what is the shared voice of that community sound like, and what is the way that you decide on what that looks like? And so it starts there as going from Discord to Twitter, but like, we'll have a Slack and Twitter and all these other inputs, and the same thing on outputs. What does it look like to post this to Farcaster or to Lens or to your newsletter or publish a podcast? What are the ways communities can start imagining the way media moves into and out of their spaces as being defined by themselves as to how they want those rules to fit? And so it was just a really amazing example that we saw communities doing this. We said, great, let's start here, help do this. Let's start expanding out from this piece and see, what do communities want to do here in terms of how they want to have a shared voice? What does that look like? And so we'll kind of build out that way. And increasingly, I think those agreements then will increasingly be on chain. They'll increasingly be things that are in fact portable, that as you build tools for communities, the communities can decide how they want those tools to work, and then they can choose to use your tool for collaboratively curating or publishing or whatever it might be. And so this is kind of the starting point of that, that I think was just a really good way to show how communities can use roles, can use rules, can set their own way across these different spaces, and start thinking about this. Who are the humans involved making these decisions, and what do they want it to look like, and not be defined by the platforms they're in. Yeah.
I really love how you talk about, but also like,
Oh, I love it.
How thoughtful all the different like decisions that you've made on how to build either Meem or Builders. It's just like, it's so thoughtful and then so lovely that I'm just like definitely rooting for everything that you do, Glenn.
Well, actually, it just reminds me of, I'll plug one more thing here, which was hugely inspirational to me. So there's 2 different communities that really broke my brain of how we are building. And so one was Joe Edelman from the Center for Humane Technology, has this way of thinking about building spaces, right? And so building spaces, rather than, a funnel is a tool builder building for the tool builder's goal, effectively, right? There are tubes, which are effectively, you build a solution, but there might be lots of different patterns that are available, but you just have, like, I think early on DAOs kind of felt a little bit like a tube. It didn't matter what you're trying to do. It's a max democratic token voting kind of thing, but I think we've expanded out from that idea. But it at least shows you there's this solution, but if you have different problems, there's still just this solution. And then I think the way of building for a space, though, where like you can allow those patterns to emerge, right? And you're not restricting what you can do. And this I think then pairs really well with we learned from Ronan at the Common Sense Makers, which is around stigmergy. And so, stigmergy is ants, right? It's like how do ants effectively use their own form of writing, which is the pheromone, that they drop around something that is of collective value to that community. So you have these stigmergic markers, right? So if you find a bit of jam, you let the community know by saying, oh, there's some jam here. But then all of those other ants are still making, they're still making effectively their own decisions, right? But it's informed by those markers that are put in that space. And so I think the Common Sense Makers also had a similar kind of way of that they call stig flows, which is how to start connecting these marks that you might make anywhere, including from Discord to Twitter, and actually like, how do you make that work so that anybody can build these patterns and kind of have this open source attention protocol? So I think these are some of the priors here that I think were massively informative for me. Like, how do you try to build a space and allow for those patterns to emerge? And I think Kernel is one of the best examples of how to see that in kind of in life, and has been like a massive inspiration and example of like, how do you do that, right? In terms of building a community around it. And yeah, so anyways, I'll point to all those priors as folks that I'm very much stealing from very, very consciously.
Can you, what is the
yeah.
name? Was it, did you say John Edelman? John Edelman?
Joe Edelman, yeah,
Joe Edelman. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. I will find it. Because did he publish something on like a, it was more like a early, I don't know, I feel like I saw something about that building spaces versus funnels and tubes. But I just tried to get the link and it doesn't work anymore. So maybe you have to share that link with us
Oh, totally.
afterwards.
Yeah,
So
we
we
should
can
totally share
repost it.
that. And yeah, and I look at it, it definitely changed the way that we're building. And you know, I a lot of credit to Joe and Ronan for putting those ideas out there. And then, man, we were ready. We were looking for like how to think about this stuff, and it just gave us a way to hold on to like, yeah, this is a thing that we can build differently around, right? We can make different choices based on these ideas. It doesn't have to be this Web 2 way of thinking and scaling of, you know, of what this needs to look like. And so I think it really it helped kind of give a lot more structure for how we think about building, you know, what is a like-minded version of the world. Yeah, so I really appreciate those guys putting all that stuff out there.
Yeah, I'm still like kind of a bit mind blown. I think perhaps now that we're like getting towards the end, perhaps like one last question to kind of wrap it up. What are kind of like the things that you found interesting or unexpected from since you started Builders and Meem that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think I think what often it kind of it transforms over time in many ways. And I think that's like what's really so special about building in this way in care with someone and a whole group of people that you really care about is that it's more revealing of yourself in many ways than it is like there's not so much a specific end goal so much as a way of being that you're trying to kind of reinforce and care about yourself. And so I think that's where I've seen it go in really different ways than like I would have predicted it. Like, oh, we want to put out this publication this way, but it was never about the publication of the thing. It was about like, what are the things we put in place as a community so that it will be the thing that we ultimately want it to be, which is not about publishing the thing and getting more people in and whatever the thing is. Like that's not the point, right? So I think a lot of it is kind of more on the self-knowledge side on that piece. But I think the stuff that sits with me most is still like how much this rhymes with so much else in the world, just the ways of thinking about like how yeah, like how something like how do communities decide what goes on their shared record, right? Like that's such a vital like what are our shared fictions? Like part of what is so like amazing about Web3 and why Web3 is this deconditioning agent, right? You know, stealing food of the gods and the way he described in psilocybin, but it's similar, right? It's like what is the way that you lose these constructs, and so you can build in these different ways. And I think that's a big part of what we can now create here is we know that like, oh, money is made up, right? Like all of this is made up, all these structures are made up, and we can make up different structures. And so, you know, all it is like, what are the shared fictions that we're going to agree on together? And so whether it's, you know, the church or academia or government, it's just, what is the process by which we decide what is true for that community? And so if we can think about abstracting them, and how do we do that in every scale of how does a community get to decide what goes on its shared record? What do they publish together? What is the truth for them? And whether that's a restaurant deciding on what meal goes on its menu and who gets to decide that, right? Like, is it it's the chef, it's the owner, it's the vendors that are supplying them with, like, there's all these, you know, different, you know, implicit decisions that are being made there to like a grant funding organization that like has to decide what impact they want to make in the world and what projects they're going to fund in what way. And so, you know, it has these same shapes of like, how do we agree together on how do we want to be together and what do we want to publish together in what way that actually goes on that record. And so I think, like, as I've thought about this kind of more broadly, it just comes up again and again and again, so that like it ends up being this really helpful tool for thinking about any community of humans that need to, you know, have some kind of agreement together that is at the base of like what they want to do in the world. And yeah, I don't know, it's found it to be just a pretty powerful framing for me, that, you know, I then can keep consistent across a bunch of these different realms effectively. That and Biddlers is the one where we get to define for ourselves what that looks like for our friends and for the people that we care about. And so it's I think just an example of that that then we can play with and make it our own. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And I wanted to ask too, like, how can people get involved in Biddlers or Meem, or how can people get involved more in what you're doing?
Yeah, totally. So Biddlers, we created a Twitter account recently, which we tweet on together, which is a Biddle BUIDL FM. And so you can hit us up there, and we can invite you over to the lodge where you can come and say hi. And then Meem is meem.wtf, and we have our own community and servers there where you can come in, and if you're interested in what we're doing, we can help you play with these tools and help build new tools together for what your community wants to do together. So really, we're excited. Anybody this resonates with would love to come and talk and see how we might help your own communities build your own tools so that you can decide where do you want the shape of things to be for yourself.
We'll make sure to link those in the show notes.
Awesome.
Glenn, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you, and I really enjoy our shared time together for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. I think I don't know if you've described me as like a talking consciousness, which I think was actually like very apt for I like in many ways, like it takes much longer for me to be able to write than it does to just it's just my way of being. And so I'm just so happy to have this space with you guys, and I know that we share a lot of these same themes of communities of care from Kernel, from elsewhere. And so it's just it's really great to be able to hang with you guys and just be able to chat about all the things I'm excited that we're doing, that hopefully we can keep building this stuff together. So thank you guys.